There's a moment after everything has fallen quiet when you finally step back and breathe. No messages, no arguments, no explanations, just silence. And in that silence, something begins to shift inside you. You start to see the relationship not through the intensity of emotion, but through the clarity that distance brings. Yet at the very same time, on the other side of that silence, something very different is happening. Because while you may be using no contact to heal, a narcissist experiences it as an unexpected loss of access, a disruption to a dynamic they believe they controlled. And in that gap between your intention and their interpretation, their hidden desires begin to surface. They don't vanish when communication ends. They grow louder in the quiet. They begin to crave the control they can't exercise, the validation they can't extract, and the attention they can no longer pull from you. And it's in that quiet divide that the truth reveals itself. No contact doesn't just expose the relationship, it exposes the person they've always been beneath the charm and chaos. A narcissist experiences no contact as something far more profound than silence. It feels like a disruption to the ecosystem they've carefully constructed around themselves. When communication stops, they don't interpret it as a boundary or a need for healing. Instead, they feel an unsettling loss of control, as if the gravitational pull they rely on to keep others orbiting around them has suddenly weakened. This is why they secretly search for ways to reestablish emotional dominance, even without direct interaction. They want to know they still have access to your inner world, that your thoughts still bend toward them, that your emotional state still references them. Control for them is not always loud or dramatic. Most of the time, it's subtle, woven through your reactions, your memories, your attention. Losing that control feels like losing a part of the self they have assembled through others. In the quiet gap created by no contact, they begin to imagine scenarios where you're thinking about them, missing them, longing for some kind of closure. They hope your silence is not a declaration of independence, but a temporary pause where you're waiting for the right moment to return. They don't necessarily want a full reconciliation. They want reassurance that their presence is still psychologically potent in your life. Even if they don't reach out, they may monitor your social media, ask about you through mutual connections, or create opportunities to be noticed indirectly. Their goal is not connection, but influence. As long as they can convince themselves that you're still emotionally tethered to them, they feel safe, validated, and in control. When they detect that you're healing or beginning to reclaim your autonomy, a quiet panic can surface behind their composed exterior. They may fantasize about ways to pull you back into their emotional orbit, whether through memories, guilt, confusion, or the kind of subtle nostalgia they know once captivated you. They are not searching for mutual understanding. They're scanning for any sign that they still reside in your emotional landscape. In their mind, your detachment challenges the narrative they crafted about who they are and how essential they believe themselves to be. So when there's no contact, what they want most is the reassurance that silence hasn't erased them, that your independence hasn't rewritten the story, and that your healing hasn't closed the door they expect to always keep open. Their desire to regain control is not rooted in affection, but in the maintenance of a psychological hierarchy where they feel superior, central, and irreplaceable. A narcissist's need for validation does not pause simply because communication has stopped. In fact, the absence of contact often intensifies this craving. Validation for them is like oxygen. It reassures them that their identity, their importance, and their carefully curated image are intact. When you were in contact, they could extract that validation directly through your reactions, your emotional investment, your attempts to understand them, or even your confusion. But when no contact begins, the supply is cut off, and this creates a void they cannot easily tolerate. Instead of accepting the separation as a natural step toward healing, they secretly look for signs that they still matter to you. They want to know that their presence, their influence, and even their absence still echo inside you. This craving for validation pushes them to wonder if you're thinking about them, replaying old conversations, or missing the connection you once believed was special. Even if they initiated the breakup or portrayed themselves as indifferent, they still hunger for confirmation that you haven't emotionally detached. Your silence becomes a canvas where they project stories. Maybe you're hurt, maybe you're waiting, maybe you're struggling to let go. They prefer any interpretation that reinforces their significance. What they fear is not your silence itself, but what might be happening inside your silence. The possibility that you're healing, moving forward, or realizing you deserve emotional safety. This is why some narcissists quietly check your online activity, monitor what you post, or look for shifts in your energy. They may not reach out, but they observe. They analyze subtle cues that allow them to believe that you still feel something for them, even if it's anger or confusion. Any emotional reaction, positive or negative, reassures them that they still hold space in your inner world. Validation doesn't require closeness, it only requires relevance. As long as they can convince themselves that they still impact you, they feel momentarily soothed. Underneath this search for validation is a fragile sense of self that relies heavily on external reflection. They need others to mirror back a sense of worth they cannot internally generate. Without your responses feeding that fragile structure, they feel exposed, unanchored, and uncertain. So even during no contact, they secretly hope that your emotions continue to revolve around them, that your silence hides longing rather than freedom, and that your distance is not a sign of self-respect, but a temporary emotional pause that still centers them. Silence holds a different meaning for a narcissist than it does for someone who is healing or setting boundaries. When you go no contact, you may be creating space for clarity, recovery, and emotional protection. But for a narcissist, that quiet space becomes a psychological trigger. They begin to feel an uncomfortable blend of curiosity and anxiety because no contact strips them of the one thing they rely on most: access to your emotional responses. This is why they start observing you from a distance, sometimes subtly and sometimes obsessively, searching for signs that you're still emotionally tied to them. They want proof that you are still orbiting around their presence, even without communication, because in their world, emotional influence is a form of power. From their perspective, silence doesn't imply detachment, it implies mystery. And that mystery becomes something they need to resolve. They may scroll through your social media, trying to decode the tone of your posts or the meaning behind a picture you share. They may linger around mutual friends, casually asking how you're doing or whether you've mentioned them. They want reassurance that your life hasn't shifted too far away from them. Every small detail, your mood, your activities, even the energy you carry, becomes data they try to interpret. They're not looking to reconnect emotionally. They're looking for indicators that you are still emotionally reachable. There's a quiet tension inside them during no contact because it clashes with their expectation of being central in your emotional world. When they don't have direct access to your mind, they attempt to access you indirectly. They imagine scenarios where you still replay old conversations, still question your worth, or still feel the gravitational pull of the relationship. These imaginations comfort them. It allows them to maintain a fantasy of importance, a belief that even in your silence, they remain a significant emotional figure in your life. The more you appear unaffected, the more they search. If you seem calm or distant, they may interpret it as strategic, not authentic. They might convince themselves you're suppressing your feelings or pretending to be strong. Your independence challenges their narrative, so they rewrite it in a way that still places them at the emotional center. They are not observing you to understand you. They observe to reaffirm a story where they still matter. In reality, what they fear most is not that you are silent, it's that you no longer feel emotionally disrupted by them. They fear the loss of your energy, your attention, your emotional availability. So during no contact, they monitor, fantasize, and search for any indication that you are still affected. because those signs allow them to feel powerful, relevant, and psychologically anchored. No contact does something profound to the internal narrative a narcissist carries about themselves. They build their identity on a sense of superiority, on the belief that they are irreplaceable, unforgettable, and central in the emotional lives of the people they interact with. When communication ends, especially if you initiated the boundary, it feels like a direct contradiction to that narrative. Instead of viewing it as your attempt to heal or reclaim your peace, they interpret it as an unexpected threat to the story they've created about their own importance. This is why they quietly hope you will break the silence first. It reinforces their sense of dominance, proving to them that your emotional world still gravitates toward them. In their mind, if you reach out, even with a simple message or a moment of vulnerability, it confirms that the connection remains uneven, with them still holding the upper hand. It reassures them that they matter more, that their absence has weight, and that you ultimately depend on the emotional closure or validation they once provided. Even if they don't consciously articulate it, they crave the moment when you initiate contact because it validates the image they have of themselves as the one who is desired, missed, or needed. This imagined scenario allows them to continue believing that they are still the dominant emotional figure in the dynamic. Your silence, however, disrupts this. It creates a space where they cannot easily assume they are the priority. And so, in that discomfort, they begin to fantasize about how the silence will end. They picture you reaching out in confusion, longing, or frustration. They expect you to fold under the weight of missing the connection or under the emotional residue they left behind. To them, this moment would restore balance, reestablishing them as the stronger, more valued individual. This is not about wanting a relationship or reconciliation. It's about wanting proof that their perceived superiority is intact. They may even test the waters indirectly. This could look like posting something meant to provoke a reaction, appearing where they know you might see them, or hinting through mutual contacts. They craft situations where breaking your silence becomes tempting or emotionally loaded. But even in these moments, they avoid initiating contact themselves because it would admit that they feel the loss of control. What they truly want is the moment when you break, when your boundary bends, and when your silence gives way to their narrative once again. A narcissist rarely interprets no contact as a boundary born from self-respect. Instead, they experience it as an open field where they can reshape the dynamic to benefit themselves. In their world, relationships are not mutual exchanges, but carefully managed stages where they dictate the emotional rhythm. When silence enters the picture, they don't see it as the end of a story. They see it as a challenge, an interruption in the script they believe they control. And because of this, they begin to imagine how they might return, reclaim, or reframe the connection on their own terms. This is where their sense of entitlement becomes most visible. They believe that the connection should resume when they decide it should. They feel their reappearance, whether through a message, an apology that isn't really an apology, or a sudden display of charm, should be enough to reset the entire dynamic. In their mind, your silence doesn't signal an ending. It signals a pause until they choose the timing of their re-entry. They rely on the belief that you still carry emotional residue from the relationship, and they assume that once they initiate contact again, the familiar cycle will resume smoothly. They may spend this period crafting a strategy. Some will imagine a dramatic return, expecting that their sudden presence will stir old feelings. Others plan a quieter approach, perhaps disguised as concern or curiosity. But at the core, the intention remains the same. They want to orchestrate the narrative so that their reappearance feels powerful, necessary, or inevitable. No contact becomes a stage where they rehearse how they might recapture your attention without acknowledging any responsibility for the pain they caused. Even if they stay silent, they're often mentally rehearsing how they might regain influence. They think about what they'll say to catch you off guard, what emotion they want to evoke, or what version of themselves they should present to lower your defenses. They view the silence as an opportunity to reset their image, to return as someone more appealing, more misunderstood, or more deserving of sympathy. They might frame themselves as the one who was wronged or as the only person who truly understands you. They may even attempt a faux transformation, presenting themselves as changed or awakened, though the underlying motives remain the same. Ultimately, they are not looking for healing, reconciliation, or genuine connection. They are looking for a moment where they can step back into the dynamic with an elevated sense of power. No contact becomes a temporary gap they hope to use to rewrite the story on their terms, with you once again playing the role that supports their narrative. What a narcissist wants most during no contact is not connection, healing, or understanding. It's access. Access to your emotions, your attention, your compassion, your empathy, and the emotional resources you once offered so naturally. For them, relationships are less about mutual exchange and more about extraction. They look to others to regulate their feelings, anchor their self-esteem, and soothe the moments when their internal world becomes unstable. When no contact begins, they lose that steady flow of emotional supply, and suddenly they must face the discomfort of having no one to draw from. This is why, even in your silence, they quietly hope that you remain energetically open to them. They want to believe that the emotional door is still cracked, that your heart is still soft when you think of them, and that the parts of you they once fed on, your empathy, your guilt, your hope, your desire to understand, are still available if they decide to return. Access for them is not just the ability to talk to you, it's the ability to tap into the emotional reservoir you once offered. They want to know that if they send a message, you will still feel a tug. If they appear unexpectedly, you will still feel startled, uncertain, or vulnerable. If they hint at regret or nostalgia, you will still feel conflicted. This desire for access is rooted in a deeper fear, the fear that you might become emotionally independent. Once you begin to reclaim your self-worth, rebuild your boundaries, and see the relationship with clearer eyes, you become harder to manipulate. Your clarity threatens their power, so they quietly hope that the emotional imprint they left is still strong enough that you hesitate before moving on. They want your healing to be slow, your clarity to be clouded, and your heart to remain accessible. During no contact, they may test this emotional access indirectly. They might post something cryptic online, knowing you might see it. They might appear in a place they know you frequent. They might check in through a mutual friend. These subtle moves are not acts of care, but probes, ways to measure whether they still have access to your emotional space. They want reassurance that they can still reach you, even without speaking. What they fear most is not your silence. It's the possibility that your silence has become empowerment. If you detach emotionally, their access disappears, and with it, the psychological comfort they once extracted from you. They want your emotional door to stay unlocked, even if neither of you walks through it. They want the option to return whenever their ego needs soothing. They want to believe that your heart is still a place they can enter, even if only to take what they need and leave again. In the end, no contact reveals far more about a narcissist than it ever does about you. While you use silence to heal, to regain clarity, and to reclaim your emotional independence, they experience it as a disruption to the power they once held. Their secret desires, control, validation, influence, superiority, the chance to re-enter on their terms, and continued access to your emotional world are not reflections of love, but reflections of dependency. They are drawn not to connection, but to what they can extract, not to who you are, but to how you make them feel about themselves. Your silence challenges that dynamic in a way nothing else can. It removes the mirror they use to see themselves, the emotional scaffolding they rely on, and the easy access they once had to your attention. And while they may observe from the shadows, fantasize about returning, or hope that you will one day break the silence, the truth is that no contact gives you something they cannot control: space. Space to breathe. Space to see clearly. Space to detach, heal, and rebuild your sense of self without the distortion of their narrative. The power of no contact doesn't lie in punishing them, it lies in freeing you. It shifts the focus back to your own healing, your own boundaries, and your own growth. And in that space, you realize that what they secretly want from you is exactly what you no longer need to give.